All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And welcome to another episode of Spring Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Vega. With me, as always, is my good friend, DaShaun. DaShaun, how are you doing?
I am wonderful. Life is good. We're doing great things. This community is awesome. I'm happy to be here. Jazz.
Jazzed. All right. We have a special guest with us today. He's right there. I don't know which side of the screen he's on, but here we go. Ryan, how are you doing, my friend?
Yeah, how are you guys doing?
Good. For those out in the audience who may not know about the great Ryan Baxter, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do here at VMware?
First of all, I would not prefix that statement with great,
I
so
would.
I would.
I would as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate the invite. Happy to chat. And yeah, I'm Ryan Baxter. I'm a software engineer on the Spring Cloud team. So I've been doing that for 7 years. Almost seems like forever, but it seems like yesterday when I first started doing it. So I've been having a lot of fun, and I work on a variety of projects on the Spring Cloud side, from config to Netflix to OpenFane to everything. If you know anything about the Spring team, it's a multi-pronged approach to maintaining everything. So we all hire our hands at everything. I've been focusing a lot lately on Spring Cloud Kubernetes and getting into that, and I know that's the topic of discussion today. So that's me, kind of in a nutshell.
Great. So I think I wanted to start with just kind of an overview before we get into. I know you have some things to share with us, and maybe I'm kind of stepping on that. If I am, let me know. But there's two kind of words in there that stick out to me: is Spring Cloud and Kubernetes. So just as a high level overview, what are those things and how do they kind of come together?
Yeah, so I'm sure most people are familiar with Spring Cloud at this point, but just like in a one-word sentence, Spring Cloud is about making it very easy to build cloud native applications using Spring technologies, right? So Spring Cloud, if you look at the vast projects that umbrella contains, is all about kind of abstracting away the cloud platform and really letting the developer focus on what they need to do, which is write some business logic and interface with the platform wherever they're running it on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a variety of projects that do that and use a variety of technologies, and so forth and so on. So um, Kubernetes obviously is one such cloud platform, right? That's
Yep.
become prominent over the past several years. And one of the unique things about Kubernetes, since it's kind of the new kid on the block, we'll say, is that they've recognized, the Kubernetes ecosystem has recognized a set of common struggles across all cloud platforms, right? So if you go to any cloud, right, and you're going to build a cloud native application, everyone needs to externalize their configuration. They need certain networking. They need, a way to discover other services. They need resiliency built in and all this stuff, right? And so they said, well, let's build this into a platform, right? Everyone needs this. Like, why not make it just commonplace? And so, and the other nice thing about Kubernetes is you can use containers, right? It's easy to package your app up and just get it up and running there. And so, um, obviously, we have a lot of developers in the Spring ecosystem that are interested in leveraging Kubernetes for that very reason. But sometimes it can be a little confusing for some people because Spring Cloud provides the same things that Kubernetes provides, right? For you as a platform. And so there's a lot of questions of like, what do you do with Spring Cloud on Kubernetes, and what makes
Yep.
sense and what doesn't make sense and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a common question that we get. So I'm sure we're going to dive into that a little bit.
Cool. All right, we have a bunch of our regular friends joining us. Hello to Thomas. Hello to Simon. Hello to Dan. Thank you everyone for showing up. Please go ahead and get your questions in now. Please feel free to ask your questions. We'll see if we can't get to them. And if we're going through something and you have a question on that, please just pop it in the chat and we'll pull it up and we'll have a good discussion with Ryan around your questions. So I have one here already. Maybe we can talk about this, or if it's going to be in something you're talking about, Ryan, just let me know. But What do you think about Spring Cloud functions in combination with server-side rendering?
I don't know if I have the answer to that one.
Yeah, that's a lot.
This is
Um,
Thomas. Thomas is a regular. He's deep. He's going to be presenting at Spring I/O here in
Awesome.
May, and he's done some really amazing things, and he's shared them. So he's done a release on one of the projects he's doing. He's doing some really cool things around time leaf. But yeah, he's got this thread around the server side rendering and what he's doing as a front end
So-
developer. Right, we've got the other package.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Sure.
maybe
yeah,
not today.
I would even
Yeah.
answer that though by saying, hey, some workloads, like even if you want to make a function out of them, you could take a Spring app and put it on something like AWS Lambda as like a REST API. It doesn't need to be its own function. You could deploy entire REST APIs on serverless if you wanted to. So I would deploy that REST API there. Again, I don't know what the use case would be for a function with server-side rendering. So
Right.
I'd have to see some examples of that.
Again, for those of us that have been around for a while, CGI bin.
I just got all my microservices updated to Spring 3.0. All right, good
man.
job. Now I need to move them into Kubernetes. Do I remove Eureka and config server? I like to have both running in Docker Compose and
This is exactly where we're
Kubernetes.
at. Dan, this is one of those conversations that we've had multiple threads on, and this is exactly what we're hoping to get into today.
Yeah, we can dive into that one for sure. That's
Cool.
kind of the crux of what we'll talk about today. I guess probably that question right there is pretty much the most common one that I get.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Okay. I think that's just another one. What setup do you use to develop Kubernetes in your local environment? So something else we can touch on.
Yep.
And GraalVM suggested. Yes, GraalVM is a hot topic. Cool. All right. I think that we can just turn it over. Oh, do you have a screen share? I think I need. Do you have that set up, Ryan? Are you sharing your screen?
I see a button to do that.
All right, let's give that a try.
And while Dan's doing that, I see another question again. Dan is asking, what's Fabricate? We have these different options for the libraries that are available. I think we're going to get into that today as well.
Yep.
And yeah, GraalVM, Kubernetes local. Last week we had Thomas Vitale on, and he talked about Kubernetes and that path of production, and he talked a lot about what Kubernetes looks like on the local environment, on what are we doing locally and how are we running Kubernetes. I'm running Kubernetes locally, kind of as a default way of running across a bunch of projects and having the same patterns.
All right, Ryan, I'll share your screen as soon as you move off the StreamYard one. I don't want to get that inception.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, just throw that over the other window here.
All right, cool.
All right, cool. All right, I assume if you guys can't see or hear something I'm doing, just let me know. So
it looks good. Maybe you can bump up the font a little.
Yeah, definitely going to do that. Here's my mouse. Here we go. All right. So just quickly, I'm not really into slides too much, but I think this kind of illustrates some of the things that we're going to talk about here via code and whatnot. And so you kind of have options, like I was just referring to when we were talking about what comes out of the box with Kubernetes and what you're used to using if you're familiar with Spring Cloud in the past, right? So we had that discussion a second ago of, the question a second ago about Eureka and the config server. And do I run those on Kubernetes, or do I just use what Kubernetes provides as far as external configuration and service discovery? And we can apply the same question to things like load balancing and things like that too. And so you have options, right? And so there are several things that are part of Kubernetes that are, we have equivalents for in Spring Cloud, right? We have a config server in Spring Cloud, and those are equivalent to things like config maps and secrets. And we have load balancing, which is done via a service instance in Kubernetes. And same thing with service discovery. That's also done via service instance in Kubernetes. And we have a discovery client in Spring Cloud, and Kubernetes just uses DNS and for the service host names as a way of making a request to or figuring out where a service lives. And you can, when you create a deployment or run a container on Kubernetes, right, you get all these environment variables with IP addresses to the other services that are available for you to make requests to, and you can look them up in environment Rails. It's a form of a discovery client, or a very rudimentary form of a discovery client. And so the question comes up is, like, what do I do? Like, I could easily build this fictional application here that uses load balancing and externalized configuration and a discovery client and all that stuff without ever bringing Spring Cloud into the picture, right? Because I can have the service that provides load balancing across, X number of pods in my application, and those pods may be, mounting volumes from externalized configurations and config maps and secrets to externalize the configuration, and all this just works out of the box on Kubernetes. So, what's the deal, right? And so this is a choice that I can't, whether you choose to leverage Spring Cloud or choose to not use Spring Cloud on Kubernetes is a choice that you have to make, right? This is not a bad solution. What is provided by Kubernetes is great. It works really well. Obviously, lots of people have built, extraordinary applications on top of Kubernetes without using Spring Cloud at all. But a lot of people like what they get with, I'm going to skip over that for a second, like what they get with Spring Cloud. And perhaps they have applications that are already using Spring Cloud and they want to move them to Kubernetes. And the last thing they really want to do is like start ripping things out of these applications. And maybe these applications are not exclusively going to run on top of Kubernetes. They're going to continue to run in other cloud environments that are using Spring Cloud. And so that's where Spring Cloud Kubernetes kind of fills the gap, right? We're going to provide the implementations for the interfaces that you're familiar with within Spring Cloud on top of Kubernetes, so that you don't actually have to change any of your code. You don't have to remove dependencies. You don't have to rip things apart or have different versions for different cloud platforms or anything like that. You just keep the code exactly the same as it is. You may have to add a thing or two to your class path. You may have to add some extra configuration, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But you can, using Spring Cloud Kubernetes, keep the rest of the code virtually the same, and it will work the same exact way as it always does. And so we have a number of components that are part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes that help you do that, right? So just to simply, we'll pick on the Spring Cloud config server, that you can deploy that to Kubernetes. And in a lot of cases, this makes a lot of sense, especially if you have an existing application that already has their configuration stored in a backend that the config server supports, right? You have a Git or SVN or a Vault or whatever, right? You don't want to take all that configuration and move it somewhere else, right? You want to keep it where it is. And so using the config server on Kubernetes still makes sense, but you may have configuration that's specific to Kubernetes. So for example, you can put that in a config map, and the config server that's part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes will use any of the existing Git backend or the existing backends that config server supports, but also supports pulling configuration in from config maps and secrets as well. For the service discovery piece, we have a Spring Cloud Kubernetes discovery server, which works a lot like Eureka, but is not Eureka. Instead, what it does is it pulls its discovery information from the services that are present on that are deployed within Kubernetes, right? So it talks to the Kubernetes API. It says, give me all the services that are here, and returns them back in a REST endpoint like you would using Eureka as well. And then you can also get load balancing. You can use client-side load balancing. Once you have that discovery server, the discovery client works, which means Spring Cloud Load Balancer will work fine. So you don't have to rely on load balancing provided by Kubernetes. While Kubernetes provides great load balancing, you honestly have very little control over how that load balancer works from a developer perspective, because it's basically set up by the operator and it's kind of a black box to you. You don't really know how it's set up and what algorithm it's using. Whereas if you're using Spring Cloud Load Balancer, you have a lot of control from the client-side load balancing perspective, how these things are going to be load balanced. You can pick the algorithm, you can configure retries. You can do all this stuff that Spring Cloud Load Balancer has. So there's a lot of advantages to going that route if you so choose. There's this other component up at the top here, Config Watcher, which I'm not really going to talk too much about today. And you'll see this RabbitMQ piece here. This is completely optional. I'll explain a little bit about this in a second, but the Config Watcher basically is a thing that you can deploy within your Kubernetes instance that's going to watch the config maps and secrets for changes. So if you make a change to your config map, you update a property or you update a secret or something like that, it will send a message to the application telling it that its configuration has changed and it needs to refresh the configuration. And so it behaves much like the automatic refresh functionality that you're familiar with excuse me, within the config server today. It can optionally use a messaging system like RabbitMQ to publish messages to all the various instances of a service to tell it to refresh its configuration, or you could do this over HTTP. You don't need that RabbitMQ piece at the top here. So it could look up all the instances from the Kubernetes API for that service and say, and make an HTTP request to each one of them, telling it to refresh its configuration for something like that. So that's another piece that's part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes that gets you that configuration refresh functionality that you might be familiar with, but does it using config maps and secrets. Again, we're not going to touch too much on that today, but that's another piece that's part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes as well. Where did DaShaun and Dan go? I don't see that. Oh, there you guys
totally
are.
here.
We're
We're totally
here.
here. We're like, you're the star of the show.
You just
Yes.
disappeared for a second. I'm like, did I lose them? Am I talking to myself? What's going
Oh,
on?
no. No,
All right.
you're here. We're good.
Okay. I just saw the video disappear. So if that explanation made sense, were there any questions that came up while I was talking that you might want to address?
There are some questions. I don't know which ones we want to get to now.
Let me keep going, and then we can maybe I'll answer some of these.
Yeah. I'm starring
Okay.
some questions as we go, so we can always come back to them. Because
Cool.
if you're gonna address something, I don't want to, let's wait until you kind of go through some things first.
Cool.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to jump into some code here. So I have a sample application here that we can use to kind of illustrate some of these concepts. So I'm just going to explain what I have here first, and then we can kind of dive into some specifics. So I have a Eureka server running locally. I have a local config server that's configured to point to Git repo out on GitHub. So we can see that here. I'll make the text bigger. Yes, sorry about that. So just point to a Git repo out there. And so nothing fancy about those two things. They're just your traditional Eureka and config server, nothing crazy going on. Then I have these three other applications, and I apologize for the naming. One of the worst things about developers is naming things, and I'm not any better than anyone else is at stuff. So it's basically a fictional sensor, like a temperature sensor. So there is just three different parts to this app. It's three different, I guess, microservices, you could say, for this application. So there's this location service here. And again, none of these are terribly interesting. This one in particular is just going to, has a single endpoint at the root here at / and it picks a random location and returns it, right? So there's this list of cities here. These happen to be cities in Spain, and it randomly picks one and returns it when you hit that endpoint. So that's basically all that application does, nothing terribly interesting. Then there's this sensor application down here. This one leverages that location service. So we will take a look at this. So first I'll open up this configuration here because this is somewhat important. So it uses Spring Cloud Load Balancer. It has a REST template that's at load balance, has our traditional at load balance annotation on top of it. So that's going to use our discovery client to look up service instances and load balance across them when making a request. And then the other interesting class here, so we have a location service here. This location service uses that REST template, right? It makes a request to the location service to get one of those random locations in Spain, essentially. And then this Spring data source here has this scheduled annotation here. So every 5 seconds this runs. And if it doesn't have a location, it goes off and gets a location, one of those random locations using location service. And then if it does have a location, and then just publishes some sensor data, right? So it publishes a sensor ID with the location and generates some temperature data, right? And it publishes that over a message queue to RabbitMQ, right? And then the thing that receives that data is this Spring Sensors application up here. And all this really does, oops, not the tests. All this really does is it has a UI, right? But it basically takes the data that gets published over that message queue and saves it into a database. And this database is just a local H2 database. It's not persisting anywhere else, but you get the idea. So it saves the sensor data into the database, and then there's a UI here that then has a simple table in it that just displays all the sensor data, right? So I already have these apps running locally here on my machine, just to illustrate what this looks like locally. And so if we look at Eureka, for example, we have our couple of service instances registered here running in Eureka. We have our config server, which is serving up data, configuration from my Git repo. And then if we go to the actual application here, this is what it looks like, right? So nothing terribly fancy, but you'll notice every couple of seconds here, this randomly updates and gets some new data, right? So that's the application, right? And it's using all the kind of Spring Cloud components that you're familiar with. We have config server, we have service discovery with Eureka, we have Spring Cloud load balancer, and so we're all this is kind of what everyone's familiar with, right? And if we look at just, for example, I'm going to show you some of the configuration here that we have. This is often the Git repo, right? This is the that's the Spring Cloud Stream configuration. I want to show. Okay, yeah. Most of this actually isn't actually terribly interesting local configuration because we're using all the defaults, so there's nothing really to configure. The config server is at localhost 8080, right? Eureka's at the same default configuration, so I don't have any configuration here. But now if we want to, the interesting part is now taking these applications and then getting them running on Kubernetes, right? So how do we do that, right? I really don't want to go about changing things. I don't want to go about ripping out dependencies. I don't want to go about changing any of my code. I don't want to do anything like that, right? You'll notice that there are, first thing here is, well, I'll come back to that in a second. So what do we do about Eureka in the config server? Well, I already mentioned in the slides that we have a config server that we can deploy to Kubernetes. That's part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes that not only will take configuration from your, in this case, the Git repo, but also will serve configuration from config maps and secrets, right? So in this case, for this application, there are some things that are specific to Kubernetes that I want to keep on Kubernetes, the configuration that's specific for these applications that I want to keep on Kubernetes, right? So I have a config map in secret here that I'm going to deploy to Kubernetes here. So this config map basically is configuring where the location of my RabbitMQ server is, right? Here I had a RabbitMQ server running locally. I already have a RabbitMQ instance running on my Kubernetes instance that we're going to use, and it's at sensors Rabbit, right? We're not going to be using Eureka, so I'm going to disable Eureka for all the applications. And I am going to go ahead and enable Spring Cloud Kubernetes, right? So you'll see that these applications, for example, if I go here and look at the POM, right? They do have both Netflix, for example, here, and Spring Cloud Starter Config, and where did I picked a bad project. Let me pick a different one here. Blah, 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 blah. There we go. So this has Spring Cloud Discovery Client on it, right? Because we're going to use the Discovery Client here. So Spring Cloud Kubernetes Discovery Client, right? Also has Eureka on the class path, right? But if you look at the configuration for this application here, we've kind of separated out the configuration. So we have configuration that's going to be activated only when we're on Kubernetes. So this is how you would do this, right? You put a separate document here and say Spring Cloud config, Spring config activate on cloud platform, and you specify Kubernetes. So this is a property, a function of Spring Boot. This is a feature of Spring Boot. This has nothing to do with Spring Cloud. This is available just part of Spring Boot. So we can put any configuration that we want that's going to be active under Kubernetes here, right? And so we specify where our config server is going to be located in this Kubernetes case, right? And the config server is what's going to pull in this config map in secret and serve it up as configuration for our application. So we have our Kubernetes specific configuration here for RabbitMQ, and we've enabled now Spring Cloud Kubernetes because we're on Kubernetes, and we have our configuration for where our discovery server is here. And in the secret, we have the username and password for our RabbitMQ instance here.
So this answers Dan's question. So one of the big questions that we had coming into it is like, how do I go from I'm working locally on Docker with Spring Cloud to I'm deploying into production on Kubernetes? What do we do? What you just showed us is it really comes down to if you're using this framework, you're using the Spring Cloud Kubernetes pieces, that all you want to do, this nice path forward is to set up these different profiles. And one of the ways that you can do it is by this Spring config activate on cloud platform. So where you're using Kubernetes, then Kubernetes is going to tell you, hey, here's where your stuff is at.
Right. So this would be the configuration that you run, all the time, right? When this document is not activated. And so like this, in this case, it would be local. You could have, any X number of other platforms here or other profiles that you enable for different things. But then once you get to Kubernetes, this document becomes activated and overrides the default, right? And so we're saying that my config server is now located here, this is the config server that's going to be running on Kubernetes, right?
And the other option that you gave where, hey, we're going to disable Eureka, I could put that in this same set that's only activated when we're on Kubernetes as well, right? I could say, hey, when I'm on Kubernetes, disable the Eureka client, use the Kubernetes discovery, et cetera. And I can put those into my same configurations.
Right. And you could put this this setting here in the local application configuration if you wanted under this profile. But since every because it's called application-config, that means every application that's going to hit the config server on Kubernetes is going to get this configuration. So we're basically saying across the board, I'm going to universally enable Spring Cloud Kubernetes because they would only get this configuration if they were talking to the config server on Kubernetes. And that way you don't have to specify this property across in every single application individually, right? You could, right? But it's just a way of kind of centralizing things, right? And then we universally disable Eureka because you're never going to be using Eureka if you're fetching this configuration from a config server that's running on Kubernetes, right?
Yep.
So that's why I decided to place them here, but these could easily be placed in the application configuration within the individual applications as well, yes.
And what you're pointing out here, another one of the questions was about, hey, we're working with the DevOps team, and how do we get the DevOps team to give us a little bit more management or power over how we're load balancing things? One of the situations that a lot of organizations are in is they don't have control over what does it look like? Where's my RabbitMQ in production? What if that changes? A lot of times that's a different org, but I still want to be able to, on the app side, my app configurations, things that were changed for a new release, et cetera, I want to be able to manage up to some certain point. Here's where things are, and everything else is going to be done by my platform team or my DevOps team, whatever that looks like. So there is going to be this trade-off. You don't want to force your DevOps team to now learn how to do the Spring Cloud config and give them access to your Git repository or other, they've already got a system. They've already got a way that they're delivering config maps and secrets to Kubernetes. And they're oftentimes providing that Kubernetes as a service to you. And your app is just landing there. And it's getting those environment variables from that.
Yep. And you could easily, the other option is like, you don't have to do this, right? If you could not use config maps or secrets at all, right? You could just rely completely on Git or whatever you want, if you wanted to, right? But in some cases, it might make sense to leverage the config maps and secrets if that configuration is truly just specific to Kubernetes. It's never going to be used anywhere else, right? You could put these properties in a document in your Git repo, and again, use something like we have here to make sure they only, even if they do get served up, they only get activated when the cloud platform is activated, right? Which is completely fine too. Like there's a million options, and this is why I kind of said at the beginning, like I'm not saying that one is better than the others. There's a lot of different choices, and you can go down various different paths through this. There's not one that's better than the other, in my opinion. So, but yeah, definitely true.
And that profile too, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not Kubernetes or not. It can have Kubernetes, and another one can be activated on if profile is dev, right? And you can combine these things. The magic that I think that you just showed is we can kind of split these concerns. If you've got somebody that's delivering config maps and config secrets to your Kubernetes already, you can still consume those using Spring Cloud Kubernetes. It's not an all or nothing. And what you showed is a good pattern for, hey, if I'm running here, then here's where I expect to get these other environment variables, attributes, configs, etc.
Yep. So I'm going to demonstrate. I'm just basically deploy these applications that I just showed you to Kubernetes, and we can kind of walk through some of that as we go through. So I'm going to apply that config map and that secret that we had here to my K8s instance, and then we're going to look at the config server and the discovery server as well for Kubernetes, right? So we have our config map and secret created. So now we're going to kubectl apply -f config server deployment. So that's going to, and I'll show you what that looks like because I realized I did not show that to you. This deployment YAML that I have here is pretty much verbatim out of the Spring Cloud Kubernetes documentation. So, don't get overwhelmed about trying to understand all this. You can literally copy and paste what you see in the Spring Cloud Kubernetes documentation, which is exactly what I've done here. And you'll have exactly the same thing.
I'm sharing the repository, your GitHub repository. I put it up on the screen for anybody that wants to follow along and bookmark that for later.
Yeah. You'll see here that there's an image that's out on Docker Hub that we're using, right? We publish as part of our release. And so that's the image that I'm pulling here and using. We're activating both the Kubernetes and Git repositories. So this basically says I'm going to use Git and Kubernetes. This is what inside the config server we refer to as a composite repository. And so the Kubernetes piece gets us the support for the config maps and secrets, and the Git piece gets us obviously our support for our Git repo. We need to tell the image where that stuff is located, specifically where the Git repository is that it needs to use. So there is at the top here, I have another config map I create as part of this deployment that specifies the directory, the Git repo for my configuration, as well as a directory which contains the configuration files, and then also we disable the secrets support by default because obviously that stuff is sometimes sensitive, so you have to specifically enable that. So that this is basically configuration for the config server running on Kubernetes. That's part of this file. So it takes care of that. And then while I'm here, I'll also show you the discovery server deployment. Again, this YAML is not, don't worry about like trying to understand it all. It's copied straight out of documentation of from Spring Cloud Kubernetes. And like DaShaun said, you can check out the Git repo with all the code in it too. This, again, is another image that we publish to Docker Hub when we do our releases. So that's basically what that's coming from. So I'm going to kubectl apply the Kate's discovery server YAML. That should go ahead and get us. So you see we have over here, I don't know if these colors are coming across too well, but we have our RabbitMQ pod that's running. We have our config server pod, which is now running, and then we have our discovery server as well. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply some of the rest of the deployments for the apps as well. So kubectl apply -f location Kate's. And again, I've built the images for these things ahead of time just to save us time. No one wants to see, I don't think anyone wants to see me run a build that builds a Docker image that then I push that up to some repository and pull it from there. But I'm not doing anything fancy in those images. I'm just building using the Spring Boot goal to build the Docker image for these boot apps. So nothing exciting or fancy going on. Again, you can look at the POM.
And most importantly, you're not writing your own Docker files.
Correct. Yeah, you'll notice that there are no Docker files in here in any of these projects. There's just, we look at the POM. I'm configuring the boot build image with my repo where I push the images to, and yeah, so nice. Nothing crazy going on there either. Terminal window, here we go. So kubectl -f Spring sensors Kate's, and all of these just have a deployment as service associated with them. So again, nothing crazy from the Kubernetes perspective either. And this is the last one, I think. Apply. And one thing I will point out is our sensor application, the one that's publishing the data, the sensor data. I did create 5 instances of that application. So in this fictional case, we have 5 sensors running of that application. So it's like 5 replicas of that. I specified in the deployment. We can see here. Make that bigger. Oh yeah, you see replicas right there. So I created 5 of them. So there's just 5 instances of that running. That's why you see a bunch of pods pop up for that specific app. If we dive over into the services, I want to point out a couple things, right? So I'm going to see if the AWS load balancer is nice enough to resolve this for me. If not, we can port forward, but it would be nice to not do that. Oops, I screwed something up. Let's try that. 188. All right. I did want to see that error. All right, so then so this is our config server. So if I then make a request to say just like application/default, which is going to give us just the default configuration that every application gets. I want to point out a couple things. So we not only get our configuration from our Git repo like we did when we were running locally, but you'll see also we're getting a configuration from those config maps and secrets that we published as well, right? So we can see here, so when any application makes a request to the config server for configuration, they're going to get these 3 property sources essentially. Right? So we get our config map property source, which has the URL to our discovery server that we have running on Kubernetes. And then we have disabled Eureka. We've enabled Spring Cloud Kubernetes, and we specified the RabbitMQ host. And here's the username and password for the RabbitMQ server. And then we have our basic stuff for, you'll notice here, like, oh, it says Spring Cloud Kubernetes enabled here, but it says Spring Cloud Kubernetes disabled here, right? So I'm playing into the fact that the ordering of these is going to the last one wins, right? Or the first one wins in this case, right? So don't be confused about that. But yeah.
So this is familiar. If we've been using Spring Cloud Config, this view looks familiar. The cool difference here is that those configs and those secrets that are deployed in that environment that we don't control as an app developer, those are now showing up in my config. So my config client is going to get those properties that have been set without me driving.
Correct.
And I get them the exact same way. So I'm not having to consume the Kubernetes secrets in any different way.
Yeah.
This is one of the big benefits.
So you could easily, like, again, the other option is like the traditional way you could mount these two things as volumes and secrets, right? And to the pods, and you could consume this configuration that way using Spring Config import and point it at a config tree or the file directly or however you want to do that. So there's other options, right? You could do that, but again, it makes it very nice and easy and clean because this is just, you don't have to change anything about your application. You just point it at the config server and it serves up the configuration just the way you would expect it to come back.
So one of the nice things, right? The Spring is a framework on top. This is what we're doing. We're setting this easy to consume abstraction. We talked about what if you've already got applications that are using Spring Cloud and you're now maybe they're running on Docker or they're running on the Cloud Foundry or other, and now they're moving towards Kubernetes. You have provided with this project a nice way to kind of bridge the gap. Like, oh, maybe you're moving to Kubernetes native everything, and yeah, that's somewhere down the road. But this is a nice gap if I'm running Docker locally or something else locally. Maybe I'm not even running Docker. I've been in the mode where I've had my Eureka server and my config server all running locally on just different ports, and I'm consuming them without Docker. Right? I still have this nice path forward for those other environments. So answering those questions, we're seeing the consistency that's being delivered by the project and this nice path forward.
Yep, exactly. I also just want to take a peek at the discovery server that we have running on Kubernetes as well. Oops. And I'll fix this URL again. Oh no, that's not the right port. Okay, yeah, all right. /apps. There we go. Okay, so I 100% modeled this JSON and the API that this discovery server uses on Kubernetes after Eureka, so it will look almost identical. But these are services that are coming coming from Kubernetes, right? So the one difference between the Spring Cloud Kubernetes discovery server and what you might be used to as Eureka is that when you use Eureka, the application registers itself with Eureka. It says here's my information about where I'm located and metadata and all this other stuff. The Spring Cloud Kubernetes discovery server, you don't do that. The application doesn't register itself with the discovery server. It's pulling all this service information from the Kubernetes service that's created when you deploy an application. So if you want to expose an application traditionally in Kubernetes, you would create a service for it. And so if you want your application to show up in this response from the discovery server, you create a service for it in Kubernetes. And that's the act of registering your application as a service with the discovery server. But you'll see this is the instance ID, the service ID, this is the host, the IP, the port, right? I'm pointing at the discovery server, so I should probably pick a different example here. So this is the Spring Sensors application, right? You'll notice that the metadata contains like the metadata from the service itself. So that's where all this is actually coming from here, right? You see the namespace in Kubernetes, which it's actually running. But this looks exactly the same. And like, if I can recall, I'm probably gonna mess this up because I don't remember the exact API here, but is that it? It wasn't exactly what I wanted. If this isn't right, then we can move on. But I just wanted to show you the instances for, I can't remember what the API is. Anyways, but there's an API which is in the documentation that where you can then dive into and see all the individual instances of the service as well. But I just can't recall what that is off the top of my head.
That's okay. It happens all the time.
No, actually, I do have it. Now it's gonna bug me. This one, is it this one? Yeah. No. Never mind. No, I'm not even gonna try. Anyways, but yeah. So then, the last thing would just show the actual application running. So just to prove that it did work. Oops. No, I really messed this up. Oh no. There we go. So this should be the app itself.
Dan is throwing up some help. It sounds like he maybe knows. Oh, it looks like.
Yeah. That's it. Yep, that's it. Dan.
We have a great community here.
You guys are great. Reading the documentation and listening to me at the same time. So this is the actual app, and here we have like 5 instances, as I said before, because I had 5 replicas of that application running. But yeah, and the key is basically the point I want to get across is Spring Cloud Kubernetes is really all about, if you want to continue using Spring Cloud and the APIs and the features that we have as part of that project, without changing any of your code, but you want your application to run on Kubernetes, we're bridging the gap by doing that. And
awesome.
Kind of keeps things simple, familiar, and provides you a path from where you are today to Kubernetes. And if you want to go ahead and go deep dive, I'm going to go all in on the Kubernetes platform and eventually rip all that stuff out. Great, fine by me, go ahead. But you got there quicker and faster and easier than you would have otherwise. So that's really, that answers some of the questions that we had initially to start out with. So
cool.
Great.
Yeah, I know.
I got a lot of clarification already. So hopefully that worked out for everybody. Let's start going through some of the questions. I think we answered Dan, his first question. I think that's good.
I starred some, so I'll go back through some of them. Thomas's question was, what would you recommend to someone who's moving into more of a cloud-focused role with Spring? I've done K8s and Helm, but only on my own VMs. What should I look at?
What should you look at? From a Spring perspective, there's a great, there's a not a tutorial, but on the VMware Tanzu Learning Center, there's a workshop that I did a few years back. That's really like a getting started workshop on Kubernetes and Spring Boot, and I think that kind of will give you a nice introduction. It's one of those nice walk-through things where you don't need to have a local K8s instance running and you use the browser and all that fun stuff. I can try and dig up the link to that.
I have it here, so I will post it in. This is the Spring Boot on Kubernetes workshop.
Yeah. That would be a good place to get started for like Spring Boot developers who are interested in getting started on Kubernetes. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, those workshops are great. I like the kind of interactive nature of them. So really good place to start. Okay, so that was one. We talked about the DevOps guys. So we cannot use Spring Cloud Gateway, Eureka Server, and client with Kubernetes.
I wouldn't say you cannot. You certainly use Spring Cloud Gateway first off. It's not set up to act like an ingress. Like you can't use it as an ingress into Kubernetes. We do have a product called Spring Cloud Gateway on Kubernetes, but that's a separate thing. The open source one is not set up that way. But you can certainly package Spring Cloud Gateway up into a Docker container and run it on Kubernetes, even if it's not serving external traffic, you can still use it there to route traffic across your applications, kind of like a what they call it, east-west traffic routing, rather than north-south. I think I got that right. Yeah, so you can certainly do that. You can certainly also package up the Eureka server in a Docker container and stick it and run it on Kubernetes and do that if you want to. Like, as far as I know, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It should work perfectly fine. All the Spring Cloud stuff around Netflix and Eureka would still work if you just package up the Eureka server and pointed it and configured the application correctly and ran Eureka on Kubernetes. That's completely fine. You want to do that, go for it. You don't need to, but that's the kind of the point here with Spring Cloud Kubernetes. But if you want to go that route, I won't tell you can't do that.
Yeah, that's like the first step. Like if you're not wanting to separate out the configs and do those profiles, that's literally your first step. Your Docker Compose is going to look very similar to your Kubernetes YAML, your application YAML that you're going to deploy. Very simple. He brought up the Spring Cloud Gateway. You brought up as well the idea. There's a new gateway spec that's being introduced. I don't know if it's available in the latest version or not. But alternatively to that, I can set up my ingress to point directly to Spring Cloud Gateway. This is another kind of cheat code, is where my ingress just points to my gateway, and then all the gateway config does all the routing. So instead of needing to expose different things through ingress, etc., I can only expose Spring Cloud Gateway. And I think that this is kind of a cheat code where I can encapsulate, like, hey, here's the north-south traffic, for example. I can say, hey, here's where everything's coming through. I can handle all of my security there. And I've kind of eliminated a lot of other concerns. The Kubernetes complexity, the options that you have can be dangerous at times. So that's another option.
Right. Yep.
Cool. I have another question here. If I want to deploy my application in a Kubernetes cluster, do I need to create a microservice first, or can I deploy it in a Kubernetes cluster at once?
So I think if your application, I'm not sure if I understand the question completely, but the way I interpret it is, if your application is what we would traditionally call a monolith, no, you can. This is one of the great things about Docker, is you can just package that whole thing up as a Docker container and just run that Docker container on Kubernetes. And so you don't need to break it apart or do any of that work before you actually take it to Kubernetes.
Yeah, this is one of those questions, like as teams are modernizing, I've got this monolith. Kubernetes provides a lot of flexibility on the types of applications that you can deploy. Coming from Cloud Foundry, for example, like we kind of had this, there's kind of a certain shape and size that fits best for the environment. Kubernetes really expands that, right? If they're not the cloud native, the 12, 15 factor apps that are going to run beautifully on something like Cloud Foundry, maybe they've got some additional needs and desires to run in production, like maps to file systems, for example. Those are things that Kubernetes kind of expands on, and it allows. But it's still your app, right? By putting it on Kubernetes doesn't change anything about your app. If your app can scale, if you can run more than one instance of your app and your app can start and stop gracefully, then that's a really good opportunity to take your app into something like Kubernetes as opposed to running on multiple VMs.
Yep.
Cool. And I know, DaShaun, you've talked a lot about this, but maybe we can discuss scale to zero for local development, or have you made that guide yet, DaShaun?
So this idea where we're running Kubernetes locally, and we've done the AOT processing, so we've got these really tight, nice, small images. I can run them on something like Kubernetes and Knative serving, where I can deploy them to my laptop. I can deploy them to my local box, and I can have them scaled to zero. That's a simple config. I do have a repository out there that kind of walks through that. And that as something that teams are now moving towards, right? As your org grows and you've got more and more products, you kind of switch your focus between app A and app L, for example. You shouldn't have to do a whole lot of work in your local environment in order to switch, in order to start testing those things. Again, I'll refer back to Thomas Vitale's demonstration of how you can do that local development against a local running Kubernetes or a cloud running Kubernetes. Either way, it's the same but not having to have a bunch of things running, right? The Docker Compose approach doesn't provide that level of scaling to zero. But with a simple change like we're seeing here with Spring Cloud Kubernetes, I can now deploy those same apps, 1 to 100 of them. I can deploy them to my laptop. I can have them scale to zero, and I can still keep Slack open. I can still have Outlook open. I can have
And
enough
Chrome,
resources.
and Chrome.
Yes.
Cool. I'm pretty sure we've talked about some of the tools that you're using as you kind of walk
Yeah.
through some of your setup. What setup do you use to develop Kubernetes in your local environment?
Yeah, I'm biased to Kind. I like Kind. It's very simple. It starts up pretty easy. Lots of people use Minikube locally, but I find Kind to be a little bit more lightweight, honestly, when we're just talking about resources and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I also kind of the more and more I use Kubernetes, or when I'm building apps for Kubernetes, I kind of just set up a dev cluster out in a cloud somewhere. It works just as well, and it kind of just doesn't. I know it costs a little bit of money, but it's kind of nice. But if I'm going to do anything locally, I do kind of tend to use Kind mostly. I will briefly mention that there's part of the test containers project. There's the ability to spin up a K8s cluster to run some integration tests against locally. Actually, that's one of the abstracts I submitted for Spring 1 this year. So
Nice.
maybe we can talk a little bit about that at Spring
Yeah.
1. But yeah, there's some nice support in test containers for doing some local testing, integration testing with that. Yeah.
Cool.
I will add one more thing. Again, Kind locally, Minikube. There's another project that's on my radar. It's Kubernetes without kubelet. KWOK is an even lighter weight setup for testing, but it's something I'm exploring for running locally when I don't necessarily need like security policies and stuff applied. I'm doing development locally, so I can get rid of a little bit of the additional options and give myself a little bit more, easier path, lighter weight.
Awesome. If we expose via ingress, does that mean we keep Spring Cloud Gateway with configs we had before?
Yes.
Yeah, it should be for the most part. Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
If you're adding an ingress on top of your Spring Cloud Gateway where your port 80 or 443 is passing it and it's going directly to that Spring Cloud Gateway service that's running, all of your configs can be the same for everything that's behind that your Spring Cloud Gateway is routing traffic for. The configs can stay the same.
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe I missed it, but why are we using Eureka in K8s and not relying on the service discovery provided natively by K8s?
So yeah, you might have missed the beginning. Basically, we're not using Eureka on K8s. What I was showing was using a separate project that's part of Spring Cloud Kubernetes. That's a discovery server. At the end, we kind of talked about, someone asked if we could run Eureka on K8s, and I said that you could if you wanted to, and I think that would work fine. But also, you could not use any of these things and rely on the service discovery provided natively by K8s as well.
Awesome.
So like when I kind of started out my discussion talking about the choices and whether you want to use directly what the platform provides or use Spring Cloud Kubernetes, that's up to you. You can make that choice, and both are valid. It's kind of up to you. I can't really tell you what the right choice is for you and your organization and your projects and stuff like that.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. It's a crappy answer. Yeah.
Is there source? Is there a source for the images? Or
so they're all part of the Spring Cloud Kubernetes project, right? So if you go on GitHub, the source for those images are right there. Yeah.
Cool. And I have one more question. Is Spring Cloud K8s have integration with Service Mesh like Istio?
No, not at the moment. Yeah. We've always kept our eye on Istio and kind of seen what's been there. To be honest, we haven't heard a lot from the community one way or the other that there's something there that they wanted support for.
There's no need for a tight integration. With Istio. But does it work with? Yes. Istio is connecting to Spring Cloud Kubernetes apps all over the world. But yeah, there's no really need for a tight integration if there's something that you're looking for. That's our job. If there's something that you're looking for in that integration between Spring Cloud Kubernetes and Istio, let us know.
Yeah.
We can help kind of set that up for that Spring team.
Yep.
I saw Alexander's note. I'll throw this up. Remember, stickers at springofficehours.io. Alexander, yours definitely went out. It was on a written envelope. I'm positive if you don't have it yet. So I apologize that you don't have it yet. Maybe send me another email. Format the address exactly the way I should be putting it on the envelope, and I'll get you out. It's going to be a version 2 sticker. I apologize. No more version 1 stickers, but I'll get those out to you.
They are highly coveted, so maybe the
Highly
mailman.
It's very possible. It's very, very possible. They're a hot commodity, especially those V1 stickers. So if you've got a version 1 sticker, yeah, you hold on to that. Maybe don't stick it out yet. Maybe don't put it on something. You save it. You maybe put it in a vault, get an NFT for it. Right? I don't know. I'm not going to, however you want to manage it. I'm just saying they are scarce. They don't exist anymore. V1, it's all gone.
Cool. Well, we have a little bit of a hard stop today, so we are going to wrap it up here. I just wanted to go ahead and thank Ryan for coming on. We have been planning this for a little while. We had a lot of feedback from the community saying we want to learn more about Spring Cloud Kubernetes. So thank you to Ryan for joining us today and dropping some knowledge on us. We appreciate it. If you have some more questions, please go ahead and feel free to let us know, reach out to us, and we will see if we can answer them in a later episode. But with that, we will go ahead and call it. Ryan, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
And we will see you guys in the next one.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thank you.
Yep.